Micah chapter 6, verses 6 to 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? This is the word of the Lord.
How do you live a good life? Part of figuring that out is to be able to determine what good is. Part of Christian discipleship is learning to discern what is good, starting to desire it, and also maturing to where you really want it, where you're wisely able to navigate the world. And it's a lot more complicated than you would think. You think it's easy enough as, okay, there are things that are good, and there are things that are evil. And the evil things may be bizarrely desirable, but we just need to resist them. And the good things are good, but they're a bit boring, and so we need to force ourselves to do them. And of course, the world is much more, those things do happen, but the world is much more complex in that good and evil, in the way the Bible talks about it, are intermingled. God has made the world good, but evil has infected everything. So it's never quite as simple as just doing something that's perfectly good or resisting something that's terribly evil. And so by analogy, if you were to think of the spectrum from healthy to unhealthy, cake is unhealthy. It's not offering you much nutritional value, but it tastes good. Because it's unhealthy, should you never eat it? If you never ate cake, that would be good for your body. But the occasion of gathering with a group for a special occasion like a birthday and having a cake, it seems to be worth it in the mix of things that it's not good for you. In fact, the sugar is bad for you, but as long as it's not the staple of your diet, you can have it. But what's healthy? Well, fish is healthy, so a very accessible fish that you could get is tuna. Should you just eat tuna all the time? Well, tuna is very healthy, but there is mercury in tuna, and so you want to eat tuna, but just not too much tuna. And then you realize most of the foods we have are a mixture of ingredients. And so there's no perfect food. There's healthy foods and there's unhealthy foods. And so you need to learn the wisdom of what the differences are so you can choose right. But sometimes you don't know. You go out to a restaurant and you order what you think is the healthy option, and you think, this is so delicious. I want to have this all the time, and I want to eat it at home. And you don't realize that at restaurants, they're not conservative about fat, sugar, and salt in the way that you might be at home. And so that striking salad may be less healthy than you understood from the ingredients that were listed out. So good and evil in the world. Sometimes the evil is so present that we're able to see it. Sometimes it's so absent that we're able to see the radiance of the good. But we need to grow in being able to discern what is good, so that what the Bible calls us to, that if we're choosing what's good and rejecting what's evil, and that becomes our way of life, it should produce good life. Verse 8 in the passage today, God, through the prophet Micah, says, He has told you, O man, what is good. So God is not keeping good hidden from us. He tells us what's good, but Micah is a prophet, and he's writing to God's people at a period of time where things are very confused. It's hard to tell if they really believe these things. They're not living good lives by this definition or standard. And so the question, if God has already told us what's good, what is the response? How do you live if you really believe that goodness, if you see it, if you experience it? What kind of life should it produce? And Micah highlights three things in verse 8. He says you should do justice, you should love kindness or mercy, you should walk humbly with your God. And it's such a comprehensive answer. It's not everything you need to know in the Bible. It's not the only verse, but if you're looking for one verse that will give you a paradigm that would get you a long way, that's pretty good. What does God require of you? Well, here are three things, and if you could hold them together in tension, This is part of a life that lives out of that goodness. As a church this year, we're planning on having a particular emphasis, a particular theme that we have the phrase, walking with God in wearying times. And that's something that we just want to be mindful of throughout this next ministry year from September through June. The weariness is with us. New York, great energy, but the byproduct of that also is a bit of burnout. So weariness is always there. But the last few years have been a bit strange. And so we're weary in ways that we don't yet know or haven't recognized or identified. But we're also anticipating the next few months, the election season, to be intense enough that if you care, you may wind up very weary by the end of it. And as a church, we believe that if you're walking with God, you'll be sustained. It's not that things will be easy or clear or perfect, but if God is with you, we can persevere. We could see and experience goodness, and we could come out on the other side with some strength. And so because that's the theme for the year, in my going through the passage today, I'm really emphasizing the third aspect, walking humbly with God. And I'm doing that because that tends to be the missing ingredient in most efforts for a good life, at least here in 21st century New York City. People are very concerned for justice. People are very concerned for kindness and compassion. Walking with God, what even is that? The Christian vision is that it's through walking with God that you'll learn what is just, and it becomes your way of life, that your heart changes with compassion, and that becomes how you live. And so if you value those things, then the concern of walking with God should be important to you. So that's going to be my emphasis this morning. I'm going to talk about three things. Where I want to begin is what I called wholeness for a good life. So if God tells us what's good, and we want that good, and we want our lives to be good, there's a certain wholeness that's needed. So all that's to say is I'm emphasizing walking with God, but the fullness of life requires these three and how they work themselves out with their implications. So the three, what are you supposed to do? Well, act justly, morally, socially. You should be doing what's right. You should not be doing what's wrong. There should be a protective instinct in you. So you should be doing justice. What else should you do? Well, you should love. But what do you love? How do you love? Well, love deeply, really, compassionately, mercifully, in an understanding way. That's really valuable. And then walk. Socially, it matters. Who are you walking with? We know that's important, what company you keep. Walk, in Micah says, with your God. So not any God, any spirituality, but this is God speaking to, the phrase we use, his covenant people. He's saying not just go find a God to walk with, but walk with your God and do it humbly. And this fullness of life, there's something in each of these that strikes how we've been designed, how we've been made in human beings. There's something in each of them that should appeal to you. But most of us wind up resonating probably mostly with one of them, and may be able to straddle two and hold them in tension. But very few of us are really thoroughly and effectively keeping all three together. And so there's something good in each of them. If you have an inclination towards justice, maybe you're a person of action. That's do justice. In other words, act in ways that are upright. And so if you're an active person, if you like clarity, if you like structure, if you want to advocate for things to improve, those are good instincts. And if you're a compassionate person, our modern values of empathy, this kindness here, where you're merciful, you're understanding, you're patient, you're loving, that's a good instinct, very valuable. And walking with God, the desire to be connected to something eternal and big. All of those desires are in us, and yet they're all profound enough and we are all flawed enough that we don't hold them in tension, and therefore we tend to, within the dominant sphere of whichever of the three that we tend to function, we tend to get a lot wrong. And so saying that you're a just person sometimes is just a way of couching your impatience or your judgmental nature or something like that. Your being merciful is sometimes just you're being afraid to do anything other than to sit with your feelings. Your walking with God could just be a way of having some kind of social identification. Who's the winning tribe? Well, if this religion or this brand within the religion is most desirable, then I'll connect with them. And for the life of God to really be working in us, that's needed for all three to thrive. Most of us inhabit realms of secularism. This is modern New York City, where there's a great concern, for the most part, in our public discourse at least, for justice, as well as for kindness and mercy and compassion. The importance of walking with God. Personally, individually, if that's your thing, that's fine, as long as you keep it in check. Don't talk too much about it, or you're open to various perspectives. That's kind of part of the mindset of these days. Or maybe there's a little bit of a cynicism. You look at all of the things that have been done wrong throughout history in the name of religion, and you say, actually, the path to justice and kindness would be better without the influence of religion. So, of course, for Christians who believe the Bible, walking with God is actually the thing that helps train us in justice and gives us the conviction for it. And the heart of God is what helps us become more kind and compassionate. So it's understandable why people would be skeptical of religion. But there's no getting out of the fact that, that in our city, even though we desire justice and kindness, we're having enough trouble holding those two together. And so are we able to be just and kind? And so some people are able to be a sufficient mix of both, but you have the people that are fighters and you have the people that are huggers, but we tend to separate into different communities. It's hard to hold it all together. And then when we talk about justice, we get a picture here that somehow it needs to be defined. And so in the church, we say, well, we're going to study the Bible to see what God has said and what God tells us. And the Christian versions of the same impulses of how as communities we wind up with our sort of more being wired in a just moral way or more being wired in a compassionate way of your church options. It's easy to find a church that maybe is bold and strong and courageous and is challenging people to live an upright life and to fight evil and people that are evil. But it's hard to know that you're really welcome there with imperfection and that you'd be helped unless you meet that standard. And then there are some churches where they highlight authenticity. They want a real spiritual life, which is a good value. But then it becomes about trying to feel so deeply and authentically that then the gathering is to try to work up an experience that hopefully will remain with you the remaining 6 days. So by the time you get to church next Sunday, you haven't lost the passion to make just decisions, but sometimes we only get as far as Tuesday, and then you realize I need some sort of a Wednesday night prayer meeting to help get me motivated again to act uprightly. So within the church, we don't have this perfect, and one of the things that we need to reflect on is to what degree is our religious practices, are they external? Are they what's natural to us rather than the vision we have here, which is where you're really walking with God in humility, where you're listening, you're learning, you're growing, and you're being changed by that. We're all getting it wrong. So it would be easy for us as a church to talk about our secular friends and coworkers, but it's more valuable for us, since we're the ones actually thinking about this morning at least, to do some reflecting on, well, what is it about walking with God that I'm not necessarily doing myself? An example of how we're affected by this. When you read the Bible, the inclination of where you are on that map of just, kind, humbly walking with God affects how you see things. And so the story of David, for example, David is one of the characters of the Bible that you get a lot of information on. And he's remembered with great regard. He was the great king, the exemplary king, at a wonderful moment in the history of God's people. But when you read the Bible, it tells his story in a fairly more thorough way, where we get his great attributes, but his failings as well. If you have an inclination towards moralism, And you think that surely if the Bible is presenting David as a noble person, he must be there in some exemplary way. You're going to be challenged because while David does set an example, think of Saul the king unjustly trying to kill him, but David out of reverence saying, I won't do it, even if he wrongly kills me. So there's an example of somebody who really has respect, reverence, honors the institution of kingship. But it's the same David who sends Uriah the Hittite off to war to die so that his own crimes could be covered. So if you're looking to David with the expectation that the Bible is fundamentally reforming me morally, you're going to look at David and say, how could he be any kind of example? Or if you're the more kind, compassionate type and you read the Psalms, David wrote so many Psalms with such rich emotional depth and fervor for God and joy and rejoicing. And so you say David is the one who has the heart for God. And then David's heart was not fully restrained when he looks at the beauty of Bathsheba and can't control his desires. And so if you're thinking, well, David's the one who's gonna at the roots make me authentic from the inside out, you have to recognize David had a lot of work going on that was needed. And even was David walking humbly with God? Yes, a lot of the time, but there are stories of his taking the census where he didn't seek God. And so if your paradigm is David needs to be the authentic, trustworthy guy, you'll find he doesn't quite fit that. Does he need to be the moral, upright guy? He's not quite that. Is he the guy that walks perfectly with God? Not quite, and yet he's remembered as all three because the Bible presents a picture of what happens when your heart is for God, when you really are receiving from God and working with God, and when you are corrected by God in the way that David, for all of his flaws and imperfections, he constantly returned and he sought the Lord with fervor and he was striving. And though he was very flawed and made a lot of mistakes, and those mistakes were costly in terms of the consequences, the Bible presents him as another human being that God was gracious to. And so we're not told to be like him. We're not told that he's our only guide and teacher. But reading about David will, the very things that trouble you about him are an example, perhaps, of finding out, well, what is it about you? Which of these three do you really feel like you most naturally gravitate with? And why is it a figure like David or Abraham or Martha or any of these figures that are presented? We struggle with them because we lack that wholeness. None of us really are just merciful, walking with God in perfect ways. And so the fullness of the life that we need, we could see the need for it, even in our Bible reading. So much of what doesn't make sense, so much of what troubles us about God is because maybe we're just, and we love that God is moral, but we wonder why God is not acting to destroy the current enemies, because we don't understand the patience and compassion of God. So moving to the second thing, weariness as a symptom that we're lacking wholeness. So the good life requires the kind of fullness Micah calls us to. And yet, because we are not holding those three in tension, and therefore even what we're doing our best at, we're not doing good enough because it's not holistic. There's a weariness that's part of the human experience, woven into the human experience and the world. And so in Micah, there's a relational problem where Micah, as the prophet, is warning God's people, you are not listening to what God has said, your behavior is demonstrating it, you're bearing the consequences of your bad actions, and oddly enough, rather than returning to God for strength and guidance, you're growing in your weariness embittered towards God. So the verses before this that we didn't read, verses 1 through 5, is God now responding to the kinds of charges that are made against him, where God is sort of becoming clear. I've made my ways known. You're not listening to them. Now you're failing, and you're starting to think there's something wrong with me. Well, why don't we take this to the courtroom? Why don't we try this? Why don't we make a case and see who's going to be standing? And so in verse 3, one of the things God says, he says, "O my people, what have I done to you?" And the context is, think of how I delivered you from slavery. Think of how I provided for you in great needs. What have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. And so God seems to be responding to a sense that God's people feel like there's a weariness to the life that he's calling them to, that they're just going to other ways that they don't realize are actually wearying them. And then they're blaming God for their present weariness. And the human condition, there's a tension in all of us, and it comes out at very young ages. But then it starts to solidify into sort of dual tracks within every person. And it's the desire to be seen, the desire to be recognized and to be cared for. And yes, that could be egotistic. So you could see in young children where they want to be thought of as the greatest. But there's something very healthy about a child who wants the parent to be aware of them and protect them and care for them and value them. And so there's something very good for our human development when you have parents that see you and respond rather than parents that ignore you. But the other interesting aspect is there's an instinct in all of us that doesn't want to be seen. So the child wants to be seen by the parent when they're doing something impressive. I've had kids that have wanted to show me the remarkable things that they could do in a video game. Look at my double backflip. I can't do that with that controller, but I would be more impressed if you turned off the TV and did a single backflip. But I will restrain that opinion for now. But here are my kids. They want me to see what they're doing and to be impressed by them. And that's a good instinct. But there are times that after dinner, you put away the dessert and you say, now remember, kids, these cookies are not for you to eat whenever you like. And then your kids somehow, over the course of several months, can intuit how long you're in the shower. And so during that unseen time, they go and then you come out, and if they're young enough, they lack the awareness that they have not yet learned to look in the mirror, so there's the crumbs in their face, and you ask, have you done anything you shouldn't do? And at that moment, they don't want to be seen. They don't want to acknowledge, they don't want to own up to it. Because that instinct is in all of us, it develops with that dual track that all of us, yes, egotistically want to be seen and admired, but there's something healthy in us as human beings that want to be known and connected and loved and cared for. But there's also something corrupt in us that says at the end of the day, I'm going to do what I want. And I want to contain those areas to my life where I get to call the shots and I'm not accountable and hope that nobody starts to think of me with those things in how they're evaluating me. And that creates a tension that is wearying, destructive to us, because then our relation to God, like our relation to other people, is we want the goodness of what God can offer us, but in our shame and with our guilt, we don't want God to fully see or to address where we need to be corrected. And so we fall into some pattern. In some cases, it's the full hiding plan where you say, I'm just not even going to acknowledge God exists. But for religious people, you wind up in a pattern where you say, I still want a good life, and I still believe that God could provide that, so I'm going to look to God for some kind of good, some benefit, some reward. But I also am terribly afraid to be completely who I am before God. And so then we wind up camping out in one of these spheres, the moralistic sphere. If I could just perform highly enough, then my conscience will always be sufficiently satisfied that God will share his good with me because I've done enough to prove that I'm worthy of it. If God is just, he would have to repay me for that. Or with the sincerity approach that if I could just be my authentic self before God, then he'll overlook my failings. And if I'm just sincere enough, then I'll trust that God's kindness will cover those things. Or the religious thing, if I could just figure out what are the practices and do them. If I could be with the right religious tribe, then I'll be fine. And what we're doing in all of these cases is trying to do something that's impossible, to say, God, I want you and all the goodness that you could give me, but I actually don't want to know you, or I really want to limit my engagement with you. And to that degree, a relationship with God, which is utterly unique because God is the creator of the universe, he's eternal, we can't see him. So to say relate to God is not easy. But it's not completely different from relating to another human being. And because we're formed with that problem, we want to be seen, and yet we want to be our own boss and be in charge of what other people see. All of our relationships are affected. And so the same thing we do religiously, we do relationally. And so in romantic relationships, the kinds of unproductive arguments where you're making a case, one person intuits, I get the feeling you don't care about me. And that's important, that's legitimate, let's bring that up. But the same argument could have different roots underneath. You could have a spouse who's thinking, I love you, I delight in you, and how do I make sure you see it? Or it could be, I feel a bit caught, but I just don't want to let on, so I'm just going to argue my case to try to get myself off the hook. The conversation could be very similar, and it could be very confusing to know what's actually happening. When the person says, you say I don't care for you, but remember that when you were sick and how I was up all night with you, and you remember last Christmas, me, that I have a cap of $50, and I got you something that was $76.20. That's not even with shipping. This is evidence, if you knew me, to know that I clearly have loved you. And then what's the nature of the argument? Is it, I really do and I want you to see it, so I'm bringing evidence to prove that there's something really there? Or is it gaslighting? Is it a way of saying, I'm trying to get the best out of this relationship and you're actually now making it less desirable, so I just want to make my case so I can move on without change? When you're in the relationship, that can be really hard, especially if you're the one saying, my intuition is, I'm not getting the sense you love me and delight in me. It's really hard. And it's really hard with human beings, and it becomes that much more complicated with God, who's not going to speak back to answer every question, and for whom, if you don't get it right, the eternity of your existence hangs on that. And so there's a weightiness to it that if you're already scared of being caught, that will terrify you to withdraw into the darkness even more. That's not what we want. And so if you look at the response here in verses 6 and 7, it's an indication something's likely wrong. Micah comes and says, I'm pointing out a number of specific examples where as God's people, you are not doing what you should do. In fact, you're doing what you should not do. And their response, clearly they're alarmed by the message. And so they say, well, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? And then he goes on, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? So in this moment, there's a sufficient recognition somehow God has now initiated an argument with us. We need to make the kind of defense that gets us off the hook. Now, the hope is that there's sincerity here. What can we do? That they're really grappling with it, but you can't tell that just by reading it. And you could easily think that in the community of God's people who are wired differently, the justice people, okay, God has just sent his prophet to corrupt us. What do? Well, let's find out what God told us to do. In the law of Moses, he told us to bring sacrifices and come to the temple. And so if that's what he wants us to do, let's do it. He's angry, and here's how we will appease him. And then perhaps the more sincere, emotional people are like, I don't know, you can't just do it because it was commanded. And so if he wants you to bring hundreds of calves, why don't we bring thousands? We need to do even better, or God's going to be angry. And you could see the back and forth of these otherwise two different people who are neglecting God in their own ways, coming back to help themselves get God's anger off of them. And so they wind up talking themselves into absurdity. So yes, the sacrificial system, when understood in the context of the life of God's people, was what God commanded. But clearly, if you study the context, they had lost their way. And so one of the ways you can see is by their going to such extremes to think, what is the most sacrificial thing that we can do? Where the question, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, which clearly that was commanded against. And yet the other nations, the pagan nations, that's what people did with their gods, where they thought we really need to work ourselves up to show ourselves completely enamored and sincere. And so how do we prove to these gods? And so if we sacrifice our most valuable thing in an ancient culture, the firstborn, the heir, the inheritance, the one carrying on the legacy, to sacrifice that would really show sincerity, really show you're paying attention. Something that was forbidden for God's people to do, with a whole system to say, I will reclaim all of your firstborn back, so you never do that. And yet there's at least two instances I'm aware of where kings of Israel got so desperate where they sacrificed their children. Evidence that in their desperation, they only proved further how far they had gone, how they don't know God, thinking that what God wants most is just the smell of a burnt offering. and misunderstanding how that plays into the life of God's people. As you think about this, where are you avoiding the fact that you're trying to keep God distant, but also trying to get something good from God? That's worth reflecting on. And how are you dealing with it? All of us in some way are relating to God in a way that we really want goodness. And if God is the one who can give it, we will do what's required of us. But all of us are also afraid or holding back or keeping some area of control of our lives. The moralistic person will work harder, will do more. If I have to do religious things, I'll do it. The emotional person will want to have a more powerful, sincere experience to prove to God that they're authentic. The religious person will, with their religious brand, try to make things right. And yet, there's something very different recommended to us. And so this is the third thing. Humbly walking with God. God's prophet has shown them what they're doing wrong, and not only they're not yet getting it, but they don't know God enough to know that what he requires of them is very simple. Hear and understand and return, and walk with me, and realign your life. He has shown you, that's one translation. He has told you what is good. Are you listening to him? Well, I'm just going to pick out a few verses. He told us to make sacrifices, so let's go do it. No, really sit and listen. What does he want you to know? Well, he wants you to know that it's not a matter of doing a bunch of things so he could reward you, or it's not a matter of working up your emotions so that you'll convince him to have compassion on you. It's a call to join your life with him and to trust him. And then those things work themselves out, that he will teach you what is right and empower you to do it. He will restore your soul so that compassion and love grow in you. And so, where do we see this? What Micah is calling for is fulfilled when Jesus comes. And when the Bible says he has shown you what is good, he has told you what is good, the Bible is calling our attention to the one person in the Bible, Jesus, who's not like David or Abraham or Martha or any of the others, but did live justly, was kind and compassionate, but clearly was walking with the Father. And so because he's told us what is good, when we listen to Jesus, what does he do? Jesus comes and he invites us to follow him. He's saying, I've come to call you back. I'm not telling you first what you need to do. I'm not telling you how to get it right. I'm not giving you the plan or the program. I'm saying God is calling you back. So he's told you what is good. Now listen to me, who's inviting you to walk with him. And one of the teachings of Jesus that stands out for many is at the end of Matthew 11, a certain expression of the invitation that he keeps offering throughout the Gospels. In Matthew 11, it's come to me all who are weary and burdened, who are all who labor and are heavy laden. Those of you who maybe you're trying, and maybe you're trying for the wrong reasons, or maybe you're trying for the right reasons, but you're weary. Come to me, all of those weary people, and I will give you rest. And then he says, take my yoke upon you. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So the yoke was a farming implement where if you had an ox to drag a plow through the field, and if you could get a second one on there, you would weary the ox less, you'd get more power, and so you could yoke them together with something that connects one ox over the neck shoulders of one ox on the neck shoulders of the other, and if they go together, there's more strength, there's more endurance. It's a better method. Jesus says, take my yoke, because my burden is easy. He's saying, I'm calling you to join your life with me. I want you to connect yourself. I want you to join with me and walk with me. And I'm telling you that my way is easier and lighter. And because of the old paradigms, what does that mean? Does that mean he requires less of us? Does that mean that there are no moral standards? And then you read the Gospels and it's like, wait a second, his standards seem higher than others. How's that not going to be wearying? Or is it that Jesus is not concerned for authenticity, but Jesus is the one that says we need to forgive our brother from the heart? And so Jesus' standard seems so much higher and so much more potentially wearying, except that Jesus is saying, but understand this, join yourself with me, yoke yourself to me, And in your tiredness, now you're going through life with me in my strength, and then we will be able to go through and endure. Which is why for where we get things wrong, the work Jesus did when he was crucified is so particularly helpful. Jesus goes to the cross in a corrupt trial and is judged. And so the justice person who knows that something needs to be done, the person who knows that at the end of the day there's accountability for our actions, has a God who's not talk without action. But we have a God who will act, but will act in such a profoundly countercultural way that Jesus will go and bear the penalty of the kinds of things we've done and deserve in order so that in his justice he could genuinely forgive us. And in the mystery of forgiveness, some of you think, but you can't just forgive, and you're right, you can't just forgive, but God doesn't just forgive. God forgives, maintaining his justice based on what he's done rather than what we've done. And so that moral impulse in you is right, even if corrupted. Your desire to do good is right, but you can never do enough. What can you bring, 10,000 offerings? It won't be enough. But one upright person who offers himself on your behalf will be. And therefore something needs to be done. It's too late for you to do it. But if you're yoked to Jesus, see what he did on your behalf and go forward with him. And then you will experience the blessing, the joy, the freedom that comes from the one who went through judgment and was now vindicated. And so the guilt that keeps us from God is alleviated when God says, your sins are really pardoned. I did something. It's not just an idea, something happened. I think the authenticity people have a harder time. I think this is where shame camps out in us, where if I've done wrong, maybe there's hope I can make it right. But if I'm just rotten, and I've always been this way, and I see that I'm so slow to change, it could feel so impossible to think, well then, how do I come to the light and expose my life before God? And we have Jesus who says, now follow me, who is stripped of his clothing, and he's ridiculed, and he's put on public display on the cross, and utterly shamed. So when he comes down from the cross, he could say, now yoke yourself to me, and I will cover you, I will clothe you, my righteousness will be your covering. So when people see you, they will not see the things that you're afraid that they will see. God, who loves and is merciful, sees, and he invites you to join with him. And so there's something potential there to say that walking with God always needs to be humble. Because it's our pride that keeps us from thinking I could do it myself, or I don't want God to see me for who I am, that keeps us from being people of justice, people who are compassionate, because we're not really walking with God, we're walking somewhere around God. And Jesus says, are you weary? Of course you are. Your guilt needs to be dealt with. Your shame can't define you. And so if you understand that you're forgiven for your mistakes, don't let them trap you. If you understand that once you're joined with me, there's a new start. So just because you've always been away doesn't mean you always will be that way. But I will cover you and I will change you. And if you, with humility, hear what I say, you will come to see the good life that I am bringing you along on. And I think it's important, the order that we have here, where he says in verse 8, he has told you what is good, and then what does the Lord require you? The telling of what is good really, I think, goes back to verse 7. Shall I give God the firstborn, my firstborn, for my sins? And where God says, that would be preposterous. But my firstborn has been given for your sins. And therefore, I've told you what is good. This is good. This is good news. This is the gospel. God is just. God is compassionate. God is real. The announcement of forgiveness has substance. It's based on something. God's kindness is so deep that he did it on your behalf. And so if you hear what's good on what he told you, then what does God require of you is to walk with him. And if you're going to walk with God, of course, you're going to have to live justly. Because that's what's good. And you're going to see that it's good, and you're going to mature and grow and want the good, and you're going to be discipled in that. And you're going to want a renewed heart, and you're going to see the compassion of God is training you in what compassion is, that all of a sudden, not only are you able to love the people that are kind to you, but you find yourself surprisingly praying for your enemy, and sometimes ending feeling love for the person that you should resent. That's what walking with God does. It's a little bit like those three-legged races where they tie the left leg of one person and the right leg of another person together, and then they have a group of people, and you're used to functioning your own way. And you could have somebody who's an Olympic, put Usain Bolt and go up to the children's ministry and pull out a third grader and tie him to Usain Bolt, and yeah, a lot of skills, but it's not going to work. At that point, the ability to learn how to be quick with somebody is now complicated. What you need is to be listening. You need to be intuiting. You need to be learning, and you need to be getting in step. And the Christian life is not easy. You join with God, and you're like, this is hard. I'm discouraged. I'm failing. But he says, but be humble. Walk with me. And Jesus says, and I will teach you. Learn from me. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you'll find rest for your souls. And so part of it is just learning, okay, if my right leg is no longer independent but needs to go with that left leg, then I need to figure out how to function with that person but take my own step. And it's remarkable that, like any other competitive thing, there are some people that take the three-legged race so seriously that there are these competitive adults, three-legged racers that could probably beat me in my two-legged race. Christian discipleship is that way, that it's not easy, but if you're walking with God, if he's teaching you, he's going to show you what's just. He's going to continue loving you so that his compassion becomes your compassion. And if you're walking with God, here's what it means. If you have a moral inclination, it means you don't need to be perfect. Yes, there are consequences for failure. Don't try to fail. Don't plan on failing. But failure is going to happen. Can you be okay? You can't be okay if the entirety of your existence is banking on things being just and right and perfect. But that's not the paradigm of the gospel. And so if you're walking with God, you have a high standard. You should strive in morally and with your life goals, but you do it humbly, which means that if you fail, you can keep walking with Christ through your failure. The sincere, authentic, emotional types. If you're walking humbly with God, you can be sustained through your emotional ups and downs. So what is it that's causing your extended dry period where God doesn't seem real? It could be your unfaithfulness. It could also be your young children. It could be your thyroid. Why do you feel the way that you're feeling over a 2-month period? It's a little bit complex. And so should you settle for apathy? Should you think that walking apart from God is okay? No. Seek God. Pursue him with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But know that the eternity of your existence does not hang on how you feel over a 3-month period. And so it's that humility to say, I know this is good, but right now I'm not feeling good, but I'm just going to walk with Jesus because I'm yoked to him. And I'm going to trust that my weary soul will find rest because he has told me what is good. So I'm going to believe him. And that's why walking with God is really this secret ingredient, that if you're looking for a good life, morally, experientially, if you're looking for restoration of your soul, if you're yoked to Christ and walking humbly with him, you'll see that he is the one who provides rest. Let me pray for us. Our Father, many of us are weary for many reasons, and underneath it are many different possibilities, but in it, our guilt is there, our shame is a reality, and our unbelief and our stubbornness and our confusion, all of that are keeping us from thriving. And yet here's Jesus, who got everything right and yet was so humble that he was willing to come to us, to call us when we wouldn't respond by your voice from heaven through the prophet. Lord, who is a God like you, who is so just that you did what was unimaginable to pardon us from our sins, that you're so compassionate, that you bear with us despite our being slow to change, and that you are so kind that you invite us again today to walk with you. And so by the power and strength of your Spirit, renew us that we would walk with vigor along with Christ this week. We pray in his name. Amen.